When the Switch first launched, Nintendo's president at the time, Jimmy Big Whip Nintendo, told God knows who in an interview that they wanted the Switch to have a 10-year life cycle. Most people, including myself, thought this was preposterous at the time, given that the hardware was about on par with the Wii U and PS3, which was outdated back in 2017, let alone now. Yet here we are at the start of the console's 7th year of life, with over 120 million units sold and really no signs of slowing down anytime soon. But even so, 4 years in the gaming world's kind of an eternity, which begs the question, can the Switch really last that long? Well, I say yes, and if you can withstand the full brunt of my Oscar-nominated intro, I'll tell you why. Okay, so just because I think that the Switch can stay alive until 2027 does not mean that I think it's going to be thriving until then, or that it's not going to be replaced. I just think it's going to thrive for long enough to be able to coast the rest of the way to the 10-year finish line until it finally bites the dust. I mean, after all, the PS2 lived for just about 13 years before Sony pulled the plug, and even then, they only did so because the PS4 was about to come out and they were probably too embarrassed to have the PS2 still be alive at the time. And you might argue that things are different now, given that the Switch's hardware is more outdated on year 7 than the PS2's hardware was in 2007. But I'd argue that the difference is actually work in the Switch's favor, seeing as how graphics matter less now than ever before. Look, I'm not saying that they don't matter, but PS3 games were significantly more impressive than PS2 games, so much so that the PS3 games just wouldn't be possible to port to the PS2. And if you don't believe me, then take a look at the third-party multiplats that tried to just exist on the Wii. Yeah, they were night and day differences, whereas games like Doom might not look as nice on the Switch, but ultimately it's the same experience as far as the actual gameplay is concerned. I mean, the main selling point's portability, with the option to play on your TV being more of a bonus than anything else. I mean, PS Vita games didn't look as good as they did in the PS3, but people thought those were cool. Like, yeah, the Switch can't get multiplats like the remakes of Resident Evil 4 or Dead Space, but it's still getting all the third-party games that aren't graphical powerhouses, not to mention there's still a pretty good flow of first-party games coming for the 7th year. The Switch is doing way better on its 7th year sales-wise than the PS2 was during the same point in its life cycle, and even though everybody, including myself, personally wants a Switch successor, the fact is that assloads of people are still playing just about every notable game coming to the console. I mean, over 120 million units sold means that less than 1% of the install base need to buy a game for it to sell over 1 million copies. And granted, a good chunk of that 120 million are families, and even people like me who bought more than one Switch, but even the people who sold their Switches only to buy another later on still lead to more people owning the console from buying one used, but regardless, there's still a lot of people who not only own this thing, but are also continuing to play games for it. So anyway you slice it, this thing's guaranteed to stick around for bare minimum 1 more year easily. However, one thing the PS2 did have going for itself, though, is the fact that it was one of the cheaper DVD players around at a time where people actually wanted to buy DVDs. Not to mention the fact that it had an incredible library of amazing and cheap games, making it probably the greatest budget console of all time, but especially during 2007 and 2013. Meanwhile, the Switch doesn't even friggin' have Netflix, so how's it possibly gonna survive another year once its successor comes out? After all, the 3DS's momentum started bleeding out the ass as soon as the Switch came out, and people were shunning the Wii before the Wii U was even announced. Well, when the PS4 and Xbox One came out, all the games on those consoles for like the first 2 to 3 years were last-gen games that were kind of just copy and pasted over to the newer hardware, and the same thing happened with the PS5 and Series X, so as long as the Switch 2 is backwards compatible, I can imagine that Nintendo wouldn't have the same type of deal going on. There were some rumors that the Switch 2 wouldn't have backwards compatibility, but those were just blown out of proportion from other rumors that the Switch 2 would have trouble with backwards compatibility. So even if the supposed industry leaks were true, it's not really the same thing. The fact that it's even a discussion shows that the new console's probably gonna still use game cards that we all call cartridges for fun. If that's the case, I'm sure Nintendo's gonna figure something out if there's even a problem to begin with. And also, I'm well aware of the fact that making games for the OG Switch and then copy and pasting them up to the new hardware that's supposed to rival the PS5 and Series X doesn't sound all that appealing to a lot of you, but like, have you seen Nintendo's first-party games before? And don't get me wrong, they look great, but they don't always rely on power, so it wouldn't really be too big of a deal for Nintendo to just kind of keep making regular Switch games that could also be played on the successor and probably run better or even have extra features, while the big AAA multiplats can be ported over with fewer problems, and then boom. Nintendo will have third parties back at full force, and like, I'm sure the Switch 2 will probably still be weaker than the PS5 and Series X, but the longer we wait for the Switch's successor, then the closer the gap's gonna be. Seeing as how there's still plenty of great games coming out for the regular Switch, I don't really see the rush for the new console. Nobody needs a Switch upgrade, we all just want one, and the people who claim to need one already have one of the other consoles or a PC that can play all the big third-party games, so I don't really see the issue with letting Nintendo make a good Switch Pro that might take a little bit longer. I mean, yeah, we have the Steam Deck, and that's great, but Nintendo can't put something like that out and have it be cheap and sleek enough to appeal to the casual consumer, or aren't gonna bother installing emulators to play Super_Mario_Galaxy_2.exe or whatever. But you know, the longer we wait, then the closer Nintendo's gonna be to releasing something as powerful, more compact, and cheaper than the good old steamer. And I'm sure some people are probably flabbergasted over the idea of buying new Nintendo hardware when the initial few batches of first-party games aren't even gonna be taking full advantage of the extra horsepower, and instead building on the heavily outdated hardware. But even so, that's great for the original Switch living to see its 10th birthday, which is what we're talking about right now. As outdated as the hardware may be for most Switch games, Nintendo's always been pretty good about having graphics that are more on the timeless side. I mean, honestly, if something like Luigi's Mansion or Wind Waker came out now for the first time, would people really not want to play it just because it was made for the original Switch and not the updated model? Honestly, I doubt it, and I doubt people would skip something like a Mario Odyssey 2 if it were a Switch game that came out while the Switch 2 was still a thing. I mean, I'm sure the Switch 2 is probably going to be kind of hard to find for like a few years, so if you only own a base Switch and can't find one of the newer models, then are you really going to ignore a game like this? Some of you might, but most people I don't think would care. You know, kind of like how people have been buying, quote, last-gen versions of games on the older consoles when the newer ones were out and they couldn't find them. As long as the boxes and cartridges are similar, I don't think the original Switch games are going to have a stigma, just like how PS4 games like Resident Evil Village that were coming out alongside the PS5 didn't have one either. I know this is all a fair bit of speculation on what I think Nintendo might do, but with an install base this big, I just don't see the rush to throw it all away and start over from scratch. I mean, I originally thought it was outlandish for Microsoft to straight up admit that they weren't going to be releasing Series X exclusives for a few years, but now I actually think it made sense to take advantage of the higher install base of the last console, especially when people were having trouble finding the newer one. Not to mention the fact that most games pretty much looked the same. Granted, not so much for the Switch versions, but Nintendo's first-party games probably aren't even going to look all that much different even if they do focus on making exclusives for the Switch too. Honestly, I feel like if Nintendo made a first-party game for the PS5 right now, it probably wouldn't be so outlandishly amazing looking that it wouldn't be able to work on the Switch. As long as Nintendo keeps all their first-party games on the original Switch and lets the AAA developers worry about carrying the first couple of years on the Switch 2 by copy and pasting all their games that they were already making for other systems anyway, then I could easily see the original Switch staying into production until 2027, especially if we don't even see a Switch 2 anytime in the near future. Hell, even if the Switch 2 isn't backwards compatible with the whole cross-gen deal, then the OG model would still have a really good shot at making it to the 10-year mark just by doing price cuts. Frig, maybe you'd even have a better shot at it this way. I mean, with a library this big, portability, and some of the best games of all time if you're including definitive ports and remasters, then the Switch could easily pull an Atari 2600 and outlast the Switch 2. I doubt this will be the case, but either way, I'd bet like $4 that the Switch will live to be 10. And you know what? I honestly think that 10 years should be the lifespan goal going forward for every console, given how little differences there are in most games these days. Then again, people update their much more expensive phones every year or two for way more money, so I don't know. Frig it. Anyway, that's all for today, but if you got a kick out of my incoherent rambling and disturbing imagery, though, then you should check out this video I made about the history of arrogant video game consoles. But if you'll excuse me, though, I gotta go to the grocery store and buy groceries. My writer's on vacation. What do you want? Later!